Hello everyone and welcome to section 2 here in chapter 20, the Atlantic world. In this lecture we're going to take a look at the Europeans settling North America. More specifically, we're going to extend this out and look at what the French, British, and Dutch did in settling North America. While in the last section we looked at mainly the Spanish, but also a little bit about the Portuguese settling in the Americas as well. So now we're going to transition to the French, British, and Dutch. All right, so let's get started. All right, so there's a lot of competition in the so-called New World for resources, and that starts with Columbus discovering the New World and opening up trade and so forth. And France, England, and the Netherlands, they want to be a part of this newfound wealth and these newfound lands. And they ignore the Treaty of Tordesillas that was put forth between Spain and Portugal. And this equals more competition for land and resources in the Americas. All right, so remember, Spain has claimed by the time that these other three powers get into this area of the world, they've already claimed a significant portion of South America. And specifically, they have the only direct route that is known at the time for access from the Atlantic to the Pacific. So these other European powers need to find another route. And ultimately what ends up happening is they can't find one, and this leads to the establishment of American colonies by these three other powers. All right, so let's first talk about France. So in 1524, Verrazano, French explorer, discovers New York Harbor, which is significant for a number of reasons for the actual city of New York later on, because the French aren't actually going to claim this area. But in 1534, Jacques Cartier is going to sail down the St. Lawrence River valley. He's going to found the city of Montreal. If you guys don't know where the St. Lawrence River Valley is, it's right here and makes its way down into the Great Lakes. And here's Montreal. Now in 1608, Samuel de Champlain founds the other big famous French-Canadian city of Quebec. And this actually becomes the capital city and base for the French colony in North America that's going to be known as New France. Now in 1673, Marquette and Joliet are actually going to explore the Great Lakes region and then make their way down through Lake Michigan, across Illinois, and get into the Mississippi River and go out that way. And then De La Salle, the last French explorer that's important here, is going to claim the Mississippi Valley for France. And this territory is going to be known as Louisiana, named after King Louis. And as you guys know, American history, Louisiana Purchase, all this territory is going to become a factor here later on in American history. All right, so the French, they established control over a very, very big, vast empire, but it's sparsely populated. They don't populate their empire like the British are going to, like we're going to see here in a little bit. But they do set it up and design it as a trading empire. And they basically send two groups of people into their empire in North America. Priests to spread Christianity, and traders to take advantage of the resources and trade them not only with the Native Americans but other European colonists, and then send the goods back also to France and Europe. So there's a lot of riches, specifically in the fur trade. The goal here for the French is money. At least initially, it's money, not occupation. So this is New France by 1712. You can see that's a significant portion of kind of the eastern half of the United States. You just take really the Atlantic seaboard out of it to the Appalachian Mountains in Florida, and you've got pretty much the French Empire in North America. All right, so now we're going to move on to the English, and specifically we have to start with Jamestown. You guys all know about Jamestown, but Jamestown was settled in 1607 in Virginia. Now, from the very beginning, the start of Jamestown, it was disastrous. Disease was rampant, food was scarce, there were attacks, but it did ultimately become successful and become the first permanent English settlement in North America. And their fortunes turned primarily because of tobacco. Tobacco becomes a very, very important, profitable cash crop. Although it's terrible in terms of impact on people's health, it is an important cash crop. All right, now we'll move north to so-called New England. So as you guys know, in about the Pilgrims. So the Pilgrims arrive in 1620 aboard the Mayflower, and they found the city of Plymouth. They're there to seek religious freedom because they're being persecuted in England for their views. Remember, there's issues going on, religious ideals and stuff in England. We'll talk more about that here in the next chapter, about really kind of why this actually happens. Now, a few years later, you have a group of Puritans that sail from England to the area around Plymouth, and they found the Massachusetts Bay Colony. They're sailing for the same reasons as that of the Pilgrims aboard the Mayflower, but it's a much larger group. And they basically, what they want to do is they want to build a model society or model community to set an example for all of humanity. They succeed because the settlers come together as families. So you actually have a cohesive unit and community. And ultimately, Plymouth and the Massachusetts Bay colonies will come together and form their own colony later on, known as Massachusetts. All right, so now on to the Dutch. So the Dutch, in 1609, Henry Hudson searches for the Northwest Passage. That's the so-called route Europeans were searching for to get from Europe to Asia. Because remember, the Spanish control the only route in the Straits of Magellan. They're trying to find that Northwest Passage. So he's exploring through the Hudson River, up New York Harbor, Hudson Strait, Hudson Bay. They get named after him because he's plotting these areas and so forth. Now, he ends up setting up trade with the Iroquois, and specifically setting up posts to trade with them. Specifically, two very important ones. Fort Orange, which is modern-day Albany, the capital of New York State, and then on the island of Manhattan. And now the Dutch are going to purchase Manhattan from the Native Americans for what's roughly the equivalent of like $24. So it's a pretty good deal in the long run in terms of what happens on Manhattan. Now, what happens is in 1621 is the Dutch West India Company, which is the exact same thing as the Dutch East India Company we talked about in the last chapter, except for now they're in the West Indies, so just based differently, is setting up to colonize the region and expanding the fur trade. So ultimately what ends up happening is the holdings that are claimed by the Dutch in North America become known as New Netherland. And they open up their colony to other settlers as well, because the Dutch aren't huge in population. So they realize, hey, if we're going to have a colony, we need to have everybody come. And they open it up to English, French, Germans, Scandinavians, like from Sweden, Finland, are coming over. So they open it up to others. So it's kind of a mixed community led by the Dutch. Now, we're going to move down south into the West Indies, or the Caribbean. So we know that Spain has taken over a significant portion of the West Indies and northern South America and most of Central America. But there's a remaining number of islands that are there. And you guys can see that this is actually moving around and showing you who gets claimed and how territory changes over time between 1700 and 2000. But what ends up happening is these European states start carving up the islands of the Caribbean. Here's how this basically plays out. The French get Haiti. If you guys don't know where Haiti is, Haiti's right here. They also get Guadeloupe and Martinique. And these are very important because they're going to be used for sugar and cotton, but specifically in the French case, sugar. The English are going to get Barbados and the Bahamas and a number of other islands, okay? And then a little bit of an influence here at various points along the coastlines of Central America. And by the way, when I said Barbados, I wasn't actually circling it. That's the Bahamas. Sorry. They get this for the same reason, sugar and cotton. The Dutch, they're going to capture some tiny islands known as Aruba and the Netherlands Antilles, and they're going to take them away from Spain because the Netherlands, was actually part of the Spanish Empire for a time earlier on, and there's going to be some influences there, but we can't get into that here in this course right now. Now, again, this sugar and cotton are going to lead to the development of plantation farming, or at least, if it's not initially developed, the expansion of it. And this ultimately leads to the expansion of the slave trade. And that's very, very important for what we're going to be talking in the next section when we talk about the Atlantic slave trade. You're going to need slaves, you're going to need labor to harvest the amount of cotton and sugar that is demanded by these European colonizers. All right, so there's some struggles. So for the English, they're threatened by the Dutch. Not so much because the Dutch are like really powerful militarily, but it's because they're splitting up the British colonies in America. And think about it this way. The Dutch are in New York. New York is in between Massachusetts, the northern British colonies, and Virginia, the southern British colonies. So there's a threat there. They're split. So in 1664, the English under the English surround the Dutch. They get the Dutch to surrender. They rename this area known as New York. With this seizure of New York, the British now have pretty much the entirety of the Atlantic coastline open for themselves to colonize. And this ultimately will lead to what is going to be known as the 13 colonies and the original United States once the U.S. Fights and wins its War of Independence against the British. Now, the British are going to push west. Now, by pushing west, and I'm going to go back a few slides. By pushing west, so they're along the coast, they're going to come into contact with French-controlled lands. And that's going to lead to some conflict as well. In particular, it's ultimately going to lead to a war known as the French and Indian War in 1754, where you have conflicts erupting over claims between the English and the French, as well as Native Americans that are primarily allied to the French over the Ohio Valley. Now, after a couple of years, this conflict will actually breed into an even larger conflict. In some ways, people think it's almost like a world war, because in a way it kind of is. And this conflict will be known as the 7 Years' War, which is the war fought in Europe. So even though the French and Indian War is going on at the same time as the 7 Years' War, they keep them separate in terms of their claims or like how they title them. Now, the French are going to lose this war in 1763, and essentially what ends up happening is they surrender all of their big land assets in America. They keep a couple of small islands. Most notably, they keep Haiti, Martinique, and Guadeloupe, as well as a couple islands off the coast of Canada. So they actually keep the main resource-rich areas that they want, but they lose their main North American holdings. Here you guys can see what I'm talking about here. This is what the situation's like at the start of the French and Indian War. Look at all this land the French have. And then look at what they end up giving up and with the loss of their loss in the French and Indian War. And they keep Haiti here, and then St. Pierre and Miquelon are those two small islands off the coast of Canada. And you can't see it, but Martinique and Guadeloupe are over here, and they keep those. All right, so the Native Americans, how are they affected by this? First off, for the most part, their relationships with the French and the Dutch are positive, mainly because the French and Dutch aren't there for they're mainly there for trading, specifically trading furs and other goods. They're not there to totally colonize and take over the area, not like the British. The British are there to fully take over and colonize. And you have very strained relationships with the Native Americans and the English, at least early on, and it has to do with over land and religion. Now, the difference between the French, Dutch, and English is that the English, again, I know I already said this, is they want to populate the colonies. And they ultimately slowly push the natives off the land. And they consider the Native Americans as uncivilized heathens, which we know they're not. But this leads to strains and animosity between the two groups. And it's primarily why in the French and Indian War, the majority of the Indians or Native Americans side with the French. Here you guys can see a famous painting of coming from the French and Indian, about the French and Indian War, not coming from the French and Indian War. It wasn't painted then. You can see Native Americans fighting for the French, ambushing a British column here in this painting. All right, so conflicts and disease. Because of the hostility that's going to exist between the British and many of the Native American groups across various colonies, you're going to have warfare. And here's just a few examples. In 1621, the Powhatan, who are the Native Americans that actually are outside of the Jamestown colony, actually attack, and there's a little bit of a war there. So relationships are strained there. The most important one in terms of conflict, at least early on, between Native Americans and the British is King Philip's War, or Metacom's War, where Metacom attacks the colonies in Massachusetts, and he's ultimately defeated. But again, just like we talked about in the last section, disease is going to play an important role here in North America, as just like in Central America and South America with the Spanish, the British, the British, the French, the Dutch are going to bring in European diseases, and it's going to decimate the Native American population. And this decimation of the population leads to severe shortages of labor, just like we talked about in the last section, and that will actually help lead to the African slave trade expanding and exploding very quickly. All right, guys, that's all I have for you. I'll see you in the next one.